Probably not necessary. Okay. All right. What's super important in all these stories is to understand these are stories that sound fantastical. If they are fables, then we treat them one way, and if they're actually true, if they're fact, then we have to treat them another way. If it's a fable, I can be like Humpty Dumpty, right? I can understand the story that Humpty Dumpty is trying to tell me, and I can apply it to my life, and then I can kind of throw away the other bits, right? I don't have to actually believe that there was a large egg on a wall that then fell down, right? I can take the allegory for what it is. And if it's a fable, I can take what I like from it and I can throw the rest away. If it's actually truth, if it's actually happened, then I have to treat it a different way. I have to be able to say, okay, the God that's represented here, if this is actually a true story, I can't just throw away whatever I learn about that I don't like or doesn't fit my life. I have to wrestle with the God that's actually there. I have to wrestle with the opinions that that God has in this story. And then finally, I have to figure out, what do I do to react to this real God and this real opinions in this real story? So as we go through that, that's going to be important for us to think through. But it does not give us license to be an idiot, right? And so we have to understand the things that we read within context, right? Are we reading a piece of history? Are we reading some prophecy? Is it poetry? Is it using poetic language, right? Job is one of my favorite books in the Bible, but like you could quote large parts of Job and be wrong. At the end of it, God says, all these yahoos that said all these things, they're wrong. So just because I'm quoting the Bible, I could be quoting it way out of context because there were some idiots that were saying things that God says are wrong, right? That's an example. I have to understand the context. I have to see what else is like it in the Bible. I have to synthesize it. All right. So we're going to talk about Babel. Is this fable or fact? Well, first, what is it? So turn within your Bibles to Genesis 11. That's where we're going to start, and then I'm going to have you go back one page. But Genesis 11, and the whole story of Babel is only 9 verses. It's Genesis 11, 1 through 9. And it starts like this. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, it's important, and settled there. Okay, wait. We've read Shinar somewhere else. Turn back one page and to chapter 10. Chapter 10 is what people call the Table of Nations. And this is, there were 8 people on the ark, Noah, his wife, and then their 3 sons and their wives. So 8 people on the ark. And chapter 10 says, okay, from Ham, Shem, and Japheth, who were the 3 sons on the ark and their wives, these are all the people groups. And it explains all the people groups and how they spread out. And in fact, within that structure, it says, these are the people groups and the languages. But wait, there aren't any, everybody was speaking one language, but why does it say the languages? So 10 talks all through history up to a certain point in history and explains all the major people groups. And then 11, 1 through 9 goes back and zooms in and explain how the languages got jacked. So here, the plain of Shinar, 1 and 2. So now I want you to go back to 10. Inside this Table of Nations, there are a couple different asides that tell little stories. This is one of them. 8 through 12 tells a little story inside the lineage of Ham. And Cush, which is inside the lineage of Ham, was the ancestor of Nimrod. Nimrod was probably not the dude's name. It means rebel. And that's important. You're going to see it in the story. Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that is why it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So this guy was generationally famous. And it was like, if you hit like a 9-point buck, you're going to be like, I'm like Nimrod, right? So he was that famous. As a hunter. And the first sinners of this kingdom, so clearly what happened, he was a hunter, he was a great hunter, and he gathered people around him, and he was like, hey, with these people, we could like go take over some villages. And so this was the first king. This was the guy that subjugated villages, and with that subjugation, built cities. And he built Kingdom, Uruk, Akkad, Kulna, in Shinar. It's important. From that land, he went to Assyria and he built Nineveh, Roboth-ur, Kala, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Kala, which is the great city. Those words, the stuff that's in yellow has been found by archaeology, right? So they found those cities. And Shinar, where our story takes place, is basically circled in red. And you can see Babylonia towards the bottom of the circle and some of those other cities that are mentioned. And then later he goes and he founds Assyria, which is up in the north. That's the Nineveh is the upmost circle. And then down the area that's circled in black in there is U-R, and that's later important because right after this in Genesis 12, we focus on Abram, and God tells Abram, he finds him in he doesn't find him, he knows where he is, but he's in and he says, hey, I need you to go to a place that I'm going to tell you, and he walks them to the promised land, Canaan, which you've heard, which is over by the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see he goes from this side all the way over to the sea, right? Anyways, so that's Abraham. Now, back to our story, Babel. We're going to pick up in verse 3. This is 11. I'm picking back up in verse 3. And it says, as people moved eastward, they found a plain Shinar. We know where that is now, right? And remember, these are people under Nimrod's control. They said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. All right. Construction technology, right? So they were advanced. They got bricks. And then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to heaven so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So remember, in Genesis, God tells all the people, both of them, in the garden, Adam and Eve, says, hey, I give you this garden. This garden is my thing, and you're doing it in my rules, but you have a job. Your job is to expand the borders of this garden, to work it and to fill it and to fill the whole earth, right? That was their job, to fill the whole earth. And now here we see, counter to that, we see led by someone called the rebel. They are saying, no, we want to make a name for ourselves. And if we don't, we're going to be scattered through the whole earth, which is actually what God told them to do. But they didn't want to do it. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible to them. Come, let us go down. That's the same structure that we see in Genesis when talks about God creating man, right? It's us. Go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. Now we know God had lots of ways to destroy cities, right? He would just cut some angels loose or send some sulfur down. So this is really pretty tame by God's standard. All he does is confuse it. He actually doesn't destroy anything. He just confuses it, and then they scatter, which is what they were supposed to do anyways. But hold up. If this is not a fable, if it's not like Humpty Dumpty, and it's more like actual history, then what we're saying is until now, from Genesis 1 to this moment, in all of history, there has been one language and it's one people group. And then this story says that from this moment on, the people scattered. If that's true, think about this, then every ancient culture, these people that scattered, they would have carried with them the history of Genesis 1 through 11 and none after that. We would not expect ancient people groups in China to have a story of Abram, but we would expect them to have a story of the garden. Do you follow? If this is true, if it's not a fable, then history splits here at this moment. Because they were all one people, one language, and then they split, and then they scattered throughout the earth, which means the history they would have carried with them is Genesis 1 through 11. What are the big stories? Creation, Adam and Eve, the fall, the consequences of the fall, the flood, these generation names that we just looked at in 10, and then the story of Babel itself. Are you following the setup? All right. So one thing it's important to ask is Genesis 1 through 11, is it written or oral? And here's why it's important to ask, because we know from studying linguistics, linguists know that oral traditions are less reliable from a fact perspective, because oral traditions means people need to memorize the thing and then they have to quote it. And so things get rounded, it goes into poetry form, all the mnemonic devices that are necessary to be able to remember something and be able to speak it. Whereas written, language is in one place. It is down and it's not movable. And so it's important that Genesis 1 through 11, in fact, is it written or oral? And it is written. There's a bunch of examples for that. One of them is down at the bottom of this one, which is Abram, chapter 12, where I said that we go to the Abram story. But 1 through 11 shares linguistic characteristics with that area in the map. The Sumerian area, right, shares linguistic characteristics with that. And then when the story moves with Abram, and he goes from one side over to the other, and he walks around Canaan, and then actually goes into Egypt and back, it actually shares linguistic characteristics with those regions at that time. Those things indicate not an oral tradition, and also not that just Moses just wrote it, because those things would have been harmonized to the writer or the speaker, but they were not. So it clearly shows that it's a written structure and not an oral one. Moses makes editorial comments. I've got a lot, so we're just gonna keep going there. I want to delve in on this one. They have found the oldest writings known to man. They have found in this area that we circled together, and at these places called Mari and Ebla, and they found 30,000 clay tablets. And those are dated about 3000 BC, which is like the oldest human writing. And in these tablets, they had colophon phrases, and that is a phrase at the bottom of the tablet that said who the author was or what the thing was about. So it's not like our writing where it has like a heading at the top. The information was at the bottom, right? And so you would read a thing, and then at the bottom, it would say who the author was or what it was about. In Hebrew, that thing is called a toledoth, and toledoths are a generation or a history or family history. And a lot of these tablets that have been found, they're basically in two camps. One is generation histories, and the other is business. Like they sold this piece of land for 4 cows, right? Signed. And so those are the two things. But when it gets to generation histories, then follow this logic. If it was actually written and not oral, and it was written at this time in this area, in the plain of Shinar, right? Then it would share some of these characteristics. Does the Bible have these things? Does it have toledoths? And the answer is yes. And this is a really interesting way. If you want to snap a picture of this and then reread Genesis, it's enlightening. But if this is true, and they do contain toledoths, you will find them in these places. And so if you instead read it as this thing happened, and then the attribution phrase goes to the stuff above it, this is what you get. You got that God wrote Genesis 1:1 through 2:4, then Adam was 2:4 through 5:1, Noah was 5:1 through 6:9, etc., which would give us the idea. It helps us understand how these were written items that Moses was editing. So they're written works of history. They were edited and compiled by Moses. What's important to know here is they're not legend, they're not oral, and they're not fable. This is an eye chart. Up at the top, we have Adam, and down at the bottom, cut off is Abraham. But the point that I want to make here, look at Adam and in his lifespan, and he overlaps with Noah's dad. So Noah's dad, Lamech, would have talked to Adam. So that's not time for oral histories to be made up around campfires, right? The original human would have talked to Noah's dad. And Noah, when he got in the ark, he would have carried those things with him, Noah and his sons. So here we go. That's the setup. Every ancient culture would have left with those stories. And where would those show up? They would show up in however they express their culture. And I'm hitting the wrong thing. Here we go. In their literature, oh my goodness. I'm just not going to look. There we go. It would have showed up in all these places, right? Whatever their ancient cultures have. So the rest of our time is going to be, hey, what are the evidences that perhaps this is actual history versus something that's made up. And we're going to hit Babel first. So most city names in that area are Semitic. They are from the line of Shem, right? But these tablets are from the line of Ham. And we know that somebody from the line of Ham was over this area, this Nimrod dude. So why are non-Semitic people living in cities that were named by a different language? We don't know, but that's a clue, right? Perhaps when the languages were mixed up, those people left and new people moved in. Perhaps it was the exact same people, but now they were speaking a different language. And it's really not that weird if you think about it. We have cities like San Antonio and San Marcos, right? That are American cities in the state of Texas, but they are left over from when they were part of Mexico, right? So we see it in our world as well. Linguistic research. We know that languages move actually from more sophisticated to less sophisticated. When they find ancient languages, they are finding sophisticated languages, not primitive ones. Like, how about the word skibbity, right? Nobody would argue that English is becoming more sophisticated over time, right? All right. This is a possible location for the Tower of Babel. We don't know, but there are some decidedly non-Christian sources that would guess this. So the Smithsonian and then this other historian says that it was first built around the time of Hammurabi, and actually there are other people that think this guy Nimrod might be Hammurabi. Because the area they ruled is about the same and the time works. And anyways, if you look at all the generational things, we would say that it needed to be built around 2000 BC. And this particular place was. You can find it on Google Earth. You can look up Ziggurat of Babel and you can see it. This is a satellite picture. And it's massive. It's football field by football field by football field by football field at the base. And it was probably 90 stories high. So a massive, there were lots of ziggurats in the area, but this is one close to Babylon, and the dating is about right, so that could be it. Okay, so if all these ancient cultures then took these major stories with them, then we should see in the oldest things that we can find, for the oldest cultures we can find, we should see echoes of those main stories, right? That's the setup. All right, let's take a look. How about tree of life and snakes? This is from the Babylonians. And so you can see you have like angels or creatures, and they've got eagle heads, and they're guarding the tree of life. And we're actually going to see this in another one. Or down at the bottom, Babylonians had two humans grabbing a tree of life and a snake that's like standing up talking to them. Interesting story. Here we have the Greeks with the tree of life and a snake around it. Iceland has a garden that's idyllic with a bunch of rivers running through it and a tree coming right in the middle. The other one is from Azerbaijan with the tree of life. We have a Persian rug with the tree of life. We have Mesopotamia. They don't know exactly what culture the goats came from, but that's interesting. The one on the left is ancient Assyria, and you can see that's a tree of life, very similar to some others we've seen. And just to the left of it, you can see some wings. And so we get this idea of angels guarding the tree of life. This other one is Urutian, which is present-day Armenia. And I'm going to give you a close-up. So now we have the same thing, but instead of like eagle's head, they're like human-looking heads. But clearly angels and clearly guarding the tree of life, which is exactly what happens, right? When Adam and Eve get kicked out, God posts angels to guard the entrance to the garden. All right, how about myths and legends? I'm not going to go one by one, but if you're into Greek mythology, like read the story of Pandora or think about the story of Pandora and Pandora being Eve. It's the story. We're not going to hit all these, but one of the oldest languages is Chinese, and the Chinese written these forms of ancient Chinese are compound structures made of other structures within. So like look at the one on the right, for instance. The symbol for garden is made up of the symbol for dust and breath or mouth. 2 persons, and an enclosure. Sounds a lot like the Garden of Eden. More Chinese, the one on the lower left, the word for ship is the sign for boat, but what's, if you're writing the language at the time, what's the biggest ship that everybody knows that's carried with them from the story? Well, it's the ark, right? And so the biggest boat that anybody knows of in history is an ark, and that was the one that had 8 mouths inside of it, right? The Mao people, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. It's present Hunan province. You can actually look this up on YouTube. They have films of their wedding festivals, which are like crazy. But one thing they do at the wedding festivals is they recite the lineage of the groom and the bride, and of course that lineage combines. And in that lineage, we have both the Noah story and we have Adam. So in the Noah story, we have Noah, his wife, and the Bible doesn't give his wife's name, but here these folks have her name. She was Gabuluin. So Noah and Gabuluin and their sons Lohan, Loshen, and Jahu, which we call Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So that's pretty cool. And then the last patriarch that they mention, the last person in the line, they call patriarch Dirt. Fun. How about Ark and the flood? You probably have heard that every major ancient culture has a flood story. That's true. They do. This is just a few of them. There are many, many more. And the point here is you will hear people say, well, this story is clearly older than the Bible. 2 things. First, not older, because the Bible is not oral tradition. It is written tradition, right? 1 through 11. So not older. But even if it is, that's missing the point. They don't have to have the Bible. They all carried the story of the big flood with them. That's why they all have it, is because it happened, right? Population growth. Basically, you're going to have to say, if you believe this is true, you're going to have to say that we went from 8 people, because the whole world was wiped out. We went from 8 people coming off the boat 4,500 years ago to 8.1 billion, which we have today, right? You have to say that if you're going to say that this is history. And the math works. If we have an average rate of reproduction of 2.5 per live births per woman, then we get to 8.1 today. And you could say, well, there were plagues, there were pestilence. That's true. But then I would say, but we also know there were lots of times in history where people had 8, 10 kids. And so I'm going to say that that's understandable. But the other side is just simply not understandable. If we had 1.5 million years ago, which is the current evolutionary theory, that there were humanoids walking around 1.5 million years ago, and instead of 2.5 rate, we only had a 2.1 rate, there would be more humans than there are atoms in the universe, right? These numbers are astronomical. It simply doesn't work. There would have to be a series of extinction events, which that's what Noah's flood is an extinction event. All right, the ark location, it was known. The Babylonian historian, in some of these that they found, a Babylonian historian said, hey, it's in Armenia, and his story was that people would scrape stuff off of it like to use as like charms. And then he also says the people left there and they went to Sumer, this area, Shinar, that we talked about, and they built cities and settlements. Josephus, who was a contemporary of Jesus in the 1st century, said that it was in Armenia and that people sold relics. So people had been like doing the relic sale for a few thousand years. That's interesting. And then Marco Polo, who you all know from the game, right? In 1275, Marco Polo, he writes in his journals, yeah, we're done. He writes in his journals that it's there, it's in Armenia, it's called the Mountain of the Ark, but it's huge, it takes 2 days, it's full of snow, and I'm not going. Right? That's what his journal says. The star map, this guy in 1908, when they were doing a bunch of discoveries, they found in ancient Egypt, in ancient India, in ancient Babylon, in Greek, they found the same star map. The star map is like a clay tablet or other structure that had constellations on them, and they were all the same. And the people are digging up are like, cool, star map. Then put it aside. And this guy's astronomer. He's like, that doesn't make any sense because that's not the sky you see from this place, right? Depending on where you are in the world, you see different constellations. If you've lived your whole life in North America, you haven't seen the Southern Cross, right? And so he's like, no, that doesn't make sense that there would be maps of stars in places where you can't see those stars. But it does make sense if people had that star map, and then when they all dispersed, they took it with them, right? And anyways, he does the math, and he figures out that it came from about this area, which is also the area where Marco Polo and all those guys said the Ark is from. So pretty interesting. DNA evidence. The one on the left traces fathers to sons. The one on the left traces mothers to daughters. And the point is, as you track the DNA that's in all the world today, it sources back to the Middle East, which follows this idea that we were all together and then we dispersed from one place. Here's the point. If the Bible is history, there would be evidence that it is history, and there is evidence in every sort of way you want to look at it. If it's DNA, if it's art, if it's myths, if it's linguistics, there is evidence that it is actually true. The Bible was not written to be a history book. It wasn't written to be a science book. It wasn't written to be a self-help book. The Bible is the story of God and his humans. But what it does say is true, and it is reliable. If it's reliable, coming full circle to what we talked about, if it's actually true, then we can't dismiss it like Humpty Dumpty. We have to take it as true. And when we take it as true, then it means that the things that it says about God are real. The opinions that God expresses in this book are true. And then that leaves us with something to do. How are we going to react to this true God as evidence in these true stories? Let's pray. God, I thank you for the chance to be here today. Thank you for starting out a new year, thinking some thoughts about you, that you are in charge of all things, that you are in charge of history, that you are in charge, that you actively sustain all things at all times, and that what we see, whether it be ancient literature or today, they all reflect you, because you are the God of the universe that weaves all things together. Help us, Father, to recognize and to honor who you are, and as we do so, to question ourselves and see, how do we respond to you? In Jesus' name, amen.